Good afternoon, everyone, here in the Oak Room and on Zoom. We're so pleased to have the last speaker in our series on women adventurers. And today's subject is Sacagawea, enforced adventurer and essential worker in the Lewis and Clark expedition. Sacagawea was a Shoshone wife and mother of a newborn, and she was required to bring invaluable knowledge, language, skills, bravery, and her womanhood to help this exploratory expedition become an American success story. Our speaker is Dr. Nicole Nesberg from Santa Fe. Professor Nicole Nesberg, whose name is Migizi, Miigwan, which means eagle feather in her tribal name, is a designated faculty member at Santa Fe College in Gainesville, Florida. She's worked as a history professor for the past 20 years with an emphasis on race and gender on Turtle Island. And by the way, Turtle Island is the indigenous people's name for the earth, which is the home to us all. Born in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, she's a member of the Sioux tribe of Chippewa Indians and descended from the Crooked Tree Odawa. She migrated to Florida in 2005, where she's happily married and raising 2 boys. While this is her first time presenting for the Institute of Learning and Retirement, you may have caught her talks at the Matheson Museum, the Appleton Art Museum, the Harn Museum, the Jacksonville Public Library, UF, USF, or Florida Gateway. We're pleased to have Nicole Nesberg. Thank you very much, and look forward to your presentation.
Miigwan. Oh, well, it's so great to be here. Thank you guys for having me. And as she just said, I kind of go around, North Florida talking about Indigenous when I can. And I thought this was a great one to have women adventurers, and especially Sacagawea. There are more monuments to Sacagawea than any other American woman. She has the lock on that because what she did for this nation and how we remember her. Let's get into it. I'm so excited. Thank you for sharing my screen. So one of the things I'd like to mention beforehand is when we get started, I use the term Indian still quite a bit. My 84-year-old aunt told me that's who we are, that's what we are. And so in our modern culture, that has taken on less of a term that is acceptable, but it just happens to be kind of how I easily dialogue. I use Indigenous and Indians simultaneously, so I hope you can understand that. She also told me that our tribal women were known for big mouths and flat butts. So I always believe her. Those things are all true. So I'd like to start with an introduction of myself. We got it. Ooh, I was just pressing the wrong button. That was all me. The reason that we do traditional introductions is it's an honoring of you, honoring of myself, honoring of the earth. And so, Bonjour Anishinaabe, my people, and Dinawe Maganadok, all of our people you're related to, all the things you're related to. And so when we say relation in Dinawe Maganadok, we mean everything. This coffee I'm drinking, this earth that I'm standing on, the sun that's outside, everything that you have a relationship to. Migizi, Miigwan, and Deshnaka. My name is Eagle Feather. As I mentioned, in our tribe, that is some good medicine. And by good medicine, we don't mean modern medicine. We mean anything that makes us feel better, things we do to make us feel better. I went for a long walk the other day. That's good medicine. Bawating Ojibwa, if anyone has ever been to Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, the Bawating are the rapids there at the Sioux, where they have massive Sioux locks so you can get through the Great Lakes. And in addition to being Ojibwa, my grandmother was also Crooked Tree Odawa. So the 3 fires, we have 3 fires up there, Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. There's also some family lore that somehow we're related to Chief Pontiac, but proving that stuff in modern age is tough. So we just go with the family tradition. Mukwadotum, my clan is the Bear Clan. So in our tribe, we have, different clans, the Otter clan, the Crane clan. The Mukwa clan happen to be the teachers The one's the holder of knowledge, so that kind of works out really well for me as well. Chimising, I'm from originally Munising, Michigan, very, very small town in the Upper Peninsula. Our tribe is located in the Sault Ste. Marie, so I've been all around that northern area. And now, of course, I live in Gainesville, Florida, because it's hot and sunny. And as I mentioned to Debbie, they have a chance of 6 inches of snow today, and we do not. So that's why I live here in Florida, not to mention, you know, all the other things like family and job. Today's a good day. Miigzi God. And so thank you once again, Miigwech, for having me. It honors both of us when you learn more about our Indigenous culture, hence the then land acknowledgement. Fortunately, here in Gainesville, more so than elsewhere in North Florida, we have come to recognize that we're not the first nor the last stewards of this land. This land was here before us, it'll be here after us. And it is just simply our job as those stewards to thank those that came before us, the Patano, the Tamaqua, the Alachua Seminole. And we honor it by doing things like this, by learning from each other, by recognizing the culture and history that surrounds all of us. And if we can continue to do that, then we continue to be the stewards that we leave for the future generations. So there are multiple pronunciations of Sacagawea's name. I simply use that one because that's the earliest one. They have broken down since then how that name came to be, because she was a Shoshone woman from the Lemhi Shoshone over, as it shows there, in Idaho, really near the Continental Divide area of the Rockies. And the Shoshone are a massive tribe. This was their native homelands, the Lemhi, the Eastern, the Western, the Bannock. And you can see it extends all the way from the Rockies into California. That massive tribe that lived out west, and she was part of, during her youth, it was raided by one of their enemies, the Hidatsa, the Mandan. Eventually, now we call them the 3 affiliated tribes. And because of this encounter, when she was about 12 years old, she was stolen from her homelands. She was taken, her and another woman named Otter Woman, plus about 4 other children, or young women, were taken by the Hidatsa, their known enemy. And they had an 800-mile walk from Idaho to their new homelands in North Dakota. And this wasn't unusual. Many tribes that had border skirmishes with other tribes, and especially for centuries and generations, often would steal other young people and incorporate them into their tribe. It was one way of getting rid of your enemy. It was another way of, filling out your tribe. And the Hidatsa and Mandan were massive for their time. When we get to their village, it'll be a village about 5,000 people. And so if you can imagine Bismarck, North Dakota having 5,000 people compared to Washington, D.C. that had like 3,400 people. It was a sight to be seen in the middle of 1800s America. So Sacagawea, her name means bird woman, we believe. It was a Hidatsa name given to her. And so whatever her name was in Shoshone, if it wasn't Sacagawea, they just gave her, when they stole her, a new name. And that new name with the Lewis and Clark expedition was written down 30 different ways. So we have 30 different options of how to say her name. So whichever way you do it is fine. So after she and other children were taken, she has to then go live with the modern, like I said, Hidatsa, Mandan, Arikara, who are in the North and South Dakota, and they extend all the way across Montana, all the way to their enemy territory of the Shoshone. So now that tribe that she was taken from, they have a reservation in the Dakotas, and they have an enrollment of approximately 17,000 members. Before this started, I was talking to Debbie, and my tribe, for example, the Chippewa, we have about 300,000 people in North America. So to have 17,000 remaining is pretty small tribal establishment that she gets picked up and taken to. So life was totally different for this young Indigenous girl. Born around 1788, she was about 12 years old when she was taken back from the Rockies to the middle of the plains of the Dakotas, and life had to be fundamentally different. What she knew, where she grew up, what she learned, the vegetation wasn't totally the same. The Shoshone living by the Rockies would sometimes summer and hunt the bison in the plains, or they would go across the other side to the foothills and fish. So they had options about how they were going to live based on the seasons and based on the cycles. Whereas the Mandan and Hidatsa, they were agricultural. You have to have a certain amount of peace in your tribe to be an agricultural tribe, because the understanding is if you harvest, you have to have that time of peace between when you grow to harvest. And they lived upon what we call the Three Sisters, one of the most important companion planting that we indigenous know. From the northeast to the southwest, this companion planting of corns that grow up, the stalks of them, and then green beans that follow those stalks up. And depending on your geography, squash or pumpkin at the bottom to put nutrients back into the ground. That companion planting, like I said, we can find it from coast to coast. And we're looking to do that here in Gainesville. Down at Cuscawilla, we're hoping to replant those Three Sisters, perhaps at Santa Fe as well. And I know that at Micanopy last week or 2 weeks ago, I was there when they replanted the Seminole pumpkin. So I'm excited about reminding of the heritage foods and crops that we have. And that kind of, like I said, with that planting that's on the quarter of New York, I believe, on the back of the quarter, you can see those Three Sisters. The records of DeSoto talk about coming upon the local villages and having those three crops available. And so for sustaining people, those crops are fantastic, because in terms of growing and the ability for them to, especially pumpkin, to last in storage, wonderful, wonderful plants to keep eating off of. So her job when she was 12 years old, 13, 14, was to become one of the women that was harvesting the plants for the Mandan and Hidatsa. And this was a massive undertaking, because once again, the big village of them had 5,000 people living there. 5,000 people is a lot of people to feed, and there were all kinds of people that were living there. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. The corn varieties at the bottom, the kind of like variety of corn that we respect and that we grow, that is still very important to us. For the same reason, something I love to talk about, diversity. Diversity in nature is incredibly important, because if one fails, then other ones don't, you can still live. One of the biggest lessons of that was the Irish potato famine. Not just the famine itself, but the fact that one potato grew really well there. But if you go down to Peru, there's 30 different varieties of potato for the same reason. Don't grow just one, grow a bunch of them so you can keep living. So one of the people that lived in the big village was a man called Toussaint Charbonneau. And whenever you hear the term French Canadian, that usually means French and Indigenous, which was the case with him and another person that's going to join the expedition. So Toussaint Charbonneau had grown up. He was about 20 years older than Sacagawea. He had become an explorer and a fur trader. He was working for a company in the 1790s. When we have records that aren't Lewis and Clark records, they're records from the business he worked at, where an old woman or an older mother stabbed him when he was trying to rape her daughter. So this is to give you some insight into what kind of person Sacagawea is gonna, we'll use the term marry for lack of a better word. So this is the type of individual that when she is taken back, they find he already had a wife, Otter woman, who was also Shoshone, quite possibly from the same area that Sacagawea was from, within 2 years of the same age of Sacagawea. And whether he paid for her or won her in a gambling bet, which is some of the records we found, he acquired her and made her his second wife. And that's why we use that term marriage very loosely. So he has a new wife, 15, 16 years old, and he has a second wife. And with them, he really very soon after impregnates her, and she's pregnant in the summer of 1804 when the Lewis and Clark expedition is going to come along. And that's going to be the biggest part of our historical knowledge of her, because that's where we go get the most written documentation. There's some certainly oral histories. There's these few, logs from fur companies where we know about other people, but the vast amount of information is we're going to get from the journals of the Lewis and Clark, who kept meticulous journals on this voyage. So what's happening in America is impacting the world around. And what's happening in America in the 1800s is we have a new president, Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson, in his ability as president, sees yeoman farming as the ideal for the American. If you're a yeoman farmer, you can vote your conscience. You don't have a boss other than yourself. If you want to be successful, you get up early and you work hard. And if you don't, then you get up late and sleep in and, you're not a success. Wanting this desire for America, it also simultaneously happened during the Napoleonic Wars, where Napoleon, on the other side of the pond, needed money. And needing money, he made a deal with the United States to sell this vast quantity, over 800,000 square miles of land that he considered his. Now, I say it that way because there's, hundreds of thousands of people living on this land that don't really consider it anyone's but their own, since they lived there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Nonetheless, the Louisiana Purchase was made, and it gave us this vast territory from Louisiana all the way up to modern-day Idaho. And with this vastness, Jefferson wanted exploration of this. And with that exploration, they're going to create the Corps of Discovery. Now, of course, I have a problem with that word discovery because it was just a discovery for the United States. Hundreds of thousands of people knew what was there. They knew the waters, they knew the animals, they knew the crops. But it was a discovery for the new people that were going to become the stewards of it. And just, imagine for one moment, if we could, not knowing what a deer is, or an elk, or a moose, or a grizzly bear, and walking along the woods and figuring it out. That had to be something. It's good to have a guide. Good to have somebody that maybe knows that knowledge and has that knowledge before you get there. Because out of all those, you're not going to want to stumble along grizzlies, which does happen. So this gives you an idea from the purchase of Louisiana Purchase, where this expedition is going to go, starting from St. Louis up to Fort Mandan, which will be the first winter, 1804 and 1805, and then a good 1,500-mile walk for March to November across the United States, and encountering everything you can imagine encountering. Squalls, hailstorms, grizzly bears, starvation, enemy tribes. Everything is along this walkway. Finally getting to the Pacific, and we'll go into this more deeply, but getting to the Pacific in 1805, 1806, setting up camp for the winter, as you have to, because it's not great to be walking around the Northwest, or especially the Rocky Mountains, in the middle of winter, and then having to head back and do it all over again. And so this expedition had some requirements. It had some needs, and it had some duties and obligations that it had to the United States. One of the obligations to what they're going to call the Great Father, the Great White Father, Thomas Jefferson, is the obligation of meeting new tribes and establishing economic relations. So Napoleon had already done this with the French and had established relationships. Now it's time to let them know somebody else took over. And by letting them know, you hand them a peace medal. And these peace medals varied in size, bigger ones for more important tribes, smaller ones for tribes you still want to let know that you want to have a relationship with. And these peace medals were hammered out and given to Lewis and Clark and said, okay, make sure they know that, we purchased this land and we want to have a peaceful, happy economic relationship with them. And certainly for about 50 years, that worked out really well. But, the other 50 years after that is a whole nother discussion that's not meant for today. We'll get into that one next time. So this just gives you an example. And also, this is going to loop back into later in the discussion why these are important. Giving about 89 medals out to a variety of tribes, it's going to show up again in this discussion. And this just gives you some idea of how important these were, how they were held on to, how they were passed down, how they were utilized in the years to come when treaties were proposed and treaties were signed. and reminding the Great White Father that, hey, 50 years ago, Lewis and Clark were here and they said, you want to have a good working relationship. Here's our medal to prove it. Let's keep up with that. So Thomas Jefferson had to be people he trusted. One of the first people he trusts is in the U.S. Army, Captain Meriwether Lewis. He was his personal secretary, certainly somebody you can trust. Meriwether Lewis had served in the U.S. Army, and he had served underneath William Clark. So he's going to ask William Clark to share command with him. Now, technically, when it comes to the expedition, they don't share command. Generally, in military, it's really hard to share command. There's usually one person in charge and one person not in charge. The U.S. Secretary of War said the same thing. You're not going to co-command. Lewis will be in charge. Clark will be second. But throughout the expedition, they kept calling each other captain, and they treated it like shared command. So nobody else was the wiser. None of the 30 privates that were under them, for example. And so each of them had vast knowledge, and they continued to cultivate this knowledge. If you're familiar with Benjamin Rush, Dr. Benjamin Rush, they took classes from him. They learned from him before they left to learn about medicine and hopefully kind of simple procedures as they understand that this expedition was daunting. Map making, drawing, everything else that would go with this, because the demands of this expedition were big. Make friends with people that you've never met. That can be tough. They might not be super excited about you telling them you own your land. That could be equally as tough. Tell us what kind of flora and fauna you find along the way on however long this trek is, which we had, some idea of the thousands of miles on it. But I think for most of us, not having gone on that journey and walk, you don't know how bad it's going to be. Or maybe it's going to be easier than you think it's going to be. That's not it. You're also going to have tons of supplies. And by tons, that's not hyperbole. Tons of supplies are going to have to be everything from, opium, the smallest amount of medicine, to food, to these peace medals that you're going to barter, to every other thing that you're going to barter along the way. So when they took command of this shared command, they then had to find other people to come with them to create the Corps of Discovery. And Clark is going to be the one tasked with finding the people to go with him. And he really looked at Kentucky. Kentucky was the place where he thought, there were some hardy people there that were good survivalists, that had good working knowledge of how to make this kind of journey. And so he started to recruit people, recruited about 30 privates to come on this journey with him, with the idea that there'd be a cash payout at the end and perhaps land at the end. And both of those things are going to happen. And for young men in the middle of the country that are single, as everybody was single except for two very important people that we'll get to, everyone were single young men that were on this journey because they didn't want them, tied down. That's going to lead us to two things, because once again, envision in your mind single young men walking across the country and the things that they can get involved in. It's exactly what's going to happen. With that, they also were survivalists. They had skill sets. And Clark trained him up and said, okay, we're going to get our supplies together in 1803. Into 1804, we're taking off. Time to take off in 1804 from St. Louis and go on this 8,000-mile trek. So the Corps of Discovery is going to be Lewis and Clark, 5 NCOs underneath them, because this is a U.S. Army division, special division. It's going to be 30 privates. Then it's, of course, going to be a French-Canadian scout, a different one than Toussaint Charbonneau, another French-Canadian scout. Then it's going to be the interpreters, Charbonneau and Sacagawea. Also, Clark had inherited a slave named York, and he's going to be equally as important to this journey, not as important as Sacagawea. Without this, it's hard to say if it would have been a success. But he was of great interest to the indigenous, because many of them had never seen a black man. They would try to wipe off his skin to make sure, because plenty of indigenous painted their bodies, tattoos, painted bodies. That was a commonality for either, tattoos for prestige or painting for going to war. So for them to see this man walking through the woods, it was just an extraordinary a grouping of, 45 people that come out of the woods. And then, of course, there was, the dog. Got to have Seaman the dog because he even gets stuff named for him. And that, too, for a lot of Indigenous was a new thing. To see this like friendly dog's man's best friend dog following along who made the entire expedition with Lewis and Clark, it had to be a sight that caused interest. And the most important part of the interest is going to be her and her child. Sacagawea carries a baby the whole time, starts as a baby in February of 1805, grows into a nearly 2-year-old by 1806. And if you see a party coming towards you with a woman carrying a baby, you're not as concerned about their intention as you would be if it was just a group of men with guns. So this was one of her just small points of value that we often just don't think about. Just the fact that she was a sole woman, because no raiding parties ever had women with babies on their back. That wasn't part of a raiding party. So it had her baby, this black man that they'd never seen, a dog following along. What is this group? Maybe we should go talk to him. So this gives you some idea of the Corps of Discovery, painting about 100 years later. Toussaint Charbonneau, him, being, like I said, he was about 20 years older. She was about 36. She was about 16. They were, Lewis and Clark, like 20s, early 30s. York, and then I believe the last guy's representative of the rest of them. There's the rest of the Corps of Discovery. And then let's go, on an 8,000-mile walk. So 8,000 miles. Generally divide this up into about 4 segments: the preparation, first winter, second winter, and the return journey. And each of these segments, the first part, 1,000 miles, 1,500 miles, and then all of it on the way back, because as one can imagine, once you walk the first 2,500 miles, you're pretty much ready to get home. There was actually a desire and some kind of hope that there'd be a boat waiting for them over on the Pacific Ocean, but you really have to plan that out much better than they planned it out. They didn't have, Expedia where you could beep, boop, bop, call Uber and, get you back. They just had to walk it all the way back. So, as it notes here, when they met Toussaint Charbonneau in the winter of 1804 or 1805, he was described as a man of no particular merit. But both the captains and their logs continue to be more and more impressed by his very young, capable wife, Sacagawea. A woman with a party of men is a token of peace. And so that essential part of her as a worker is just one of the pieces of why she's essential. Her peace, her knowledge, her ability to translate, the fact that they're going to stumble upon her brother, all of these are going to be part of how she, as an adventurer, made this a success. So the first winter, since this is mostly on Sacagawea and not on Lewis and Clark, we'll quickly go from St. Louis to Fort Mandan, which is about 1,000 miles from Missouri up to North Dakota. And it had to be quite a trek, using boats mostly to get up there. And then the surprise at this village. For most of America, or if you just think about the vastness of our nation, they had no idea there was this 5,000 people village with Germans and French and Spanish horses and guns and this massive trade network. And it's because it's where it's located. In the middle of North Dakota, it served as a great trading spot for all directions, especially if you've been through the plains, the very flat plains. In the middle of it, you have this nugget of, well, let's go trade there because we know there's people living there and we can go in any direction, by water, by land. And so to stumble upon this, and most of the inhabitants, of course, were the indigenous, the Mandan and Hidatsa, but there were plenty of other people like Toussaint Charbonneau as trappers, or there were plenty of other traders or explorers that were living amongst this group, maybe transient, maybe staying. And so when they came upon this, as it says here, got to throw in some Stephen Ambrose, I'll even bother to quote it because great Stephen Ambrose. Nowhere else could one see at a single glance the diversity and colorful lifestyle of the Indians of the plains. There were Spanish horses and mules to buy and sell, fancy Cheyenne leather clothing, English trade guns, baskets of produce, meat products, furs of all kinds, musical instruments, blankets, dressed buffalo hides, painted buffalo hides. So you can imagine just stumbling upon this as like one of the first places you're going on this expedition. Wow, maybe there's a slew of villages and cities out here that we didn't know about. How did we not know about this one? And setting up camp across the river, building Fort Mandan, very small fort to keep the core of discovery during that winter. And then when Toussaint Charbonneau offered his skills as an interpreter, when they got hired on, taking him and his 2 wives and having them live at Fort Mandan for the rest of the winter so they could get to know each other. And at this point, Sacagawea had to be about 6 months pregnant. So 16, 6 months pregnant. He had 2 wives, and they said to Charbonneau, bring one of your wives. Now, there's no record of why one was selected over the other, why Sacagawea went and Otter Woman stayed home. Could be a variety of things. It could be the fact that when they left, Sacagawea's father was the chief of the Shoshone. Maybe you want to bring the woman who's the chief so you can get along when you see the Shoshone, not, hey, when you know who this woman is. Could be because they had a newborn. Maybe he wanted to spend time with his child and not separate, mother from child when they're going to be about 2 months old at the time of the journey. Maybe he had preferred her as his second wife. Maybe she had different knowledge. We're not sure. But she's the one that gets selected, and Otter Woman stays with the camp. So they leave Fort Mandan, and why not share this? Because it's going to snow up north right now, 45 degrees below zero. And I share this for 2 reasons. One, blisteringly cold, also an indicator of what they're going to have to deal with as they walk across the United States, and than ever they knew in the States, because this is new territory. This wasn't the States yet. This was becoming the States. A lot of information here, but it's about the winter that they stayed in Fort Mandan. It was about the skill set and the idea that Sacagawea was skilled at so many things. And this is part of being an Indigenous woman, part of survival, part of being part of your tribal survival and what expectations are. Knowing how to forage, knowing what's poisonous and not poisonous, knowing how to prepare things, being able to tell the Lewis and Clark expedition potentially, where to hunt, where to scavenge. Here's berries I found, here's licorice I found. This is how to prepare this tuber so that we can eat it. So her value, not only in being a token of peace, was in all of the working knowledge that she had as an individual. But as a mother, and I just love the idea, February of 1805, you have a baby. There's this great lore about Lewis or Clark, one of them had found a rattlesnake and they put it in a tonic and she drank it, and 10 minutes later she had her baby. So it was because of them, they helped her along the way of childbirth, and then said, all right, let's go on an 8,000-mile walk. So not the first thing I wanted to do, like 6 weeks after I had a child, not even like close to what I wanted to do. But this goes back to perhaps she wasn't the most free of individuals. It was not only, she had been with the Mandan for 4 years, she was sold and property of Toussaint Charbonneau, and he was telling her what they were going to do. But then time and time again, she proves her value. One of the first times she proves it, as it says, is the roots, the berries, finding of game, helping clean game and prepare game. And the fact that when you have, 37 men that are walking miles a day, plus a woman and a baby and her husband, the amount of food you have to consume is massive, because you just have to keep that calorie count up. And a lot of it, if you've ever tried the keto diet, is super difficult, because if it's all protein, you wear through it fast. And so part of her usefulness also was figuring out how to get the carbohydrates back into their diet for some balance, because when you're exercising, you need to have both of those for endurance. And so when they started out eating pounds and pounds of meat, sure, they kept going and they kept trekking, 10 to 20 miles a day, depending, going upriver, very, difficult, hauling literally their tons of supplies, which is going to wane by the end of it. It's not going to be tons, it's going to be hundreds of pounds. But continuing in this journey, the value of making sure that she understood sometimes when it came to endurance and digestive issues, how to help out with those things when the other people just eating new things did not. And that can happen with any of us. You're not familiar with certain foods and they're introduced to you and they taste really good and sustain, and then your tummy hurts afterwards. The understanding that what was poisonous and what was not. She wasn't out here to poison people. She was out here to keep them along their journey. Part of what they learn with her and her value is listen to her when she tells you not to eat the thing. Like, don't eat the thing when she says it. And there had to be some translation there, some really easy translation. Okay, so the diet of it, and then the leaving of the Mandan village and continuing by water for up the Missouri as long as you could. Because when it comes to traveling overland, they're going to eventually have to get off the boats. But before they get off the boats, early on, within the first month, she proves her value to the Lewis and Clark expedition. The other French Canadian was manning one of what they called pirogues, and these massive kind of boats that they had tons of supplies in that they were floating up and going up the Missouri. And Charbonneau took over, and as it says here, was piloting one of the expedition's boat, seen as one of the most timid watermen, and a squall came and it hit it and capsized it. And while Charbonneau was in the water flailing because he couldn't swim, which one would flail if you couldn't swim, plenty of the Corps of Discovery could not swim. York could swim. Sacagawea could swim. And so when he was floundering and crying out for help, they got, him to shore. Lewis and Clark were on shore watching this whole thing play out, watching their valuables, their instruments they needed, their journals, everything that was on board was just floating down the river. And so she presumably, with either her child in her arm or on her back, was swimming around, picking up all their stuff, salvaging the expedition for them. Lewis went so far as to say he would have rather died than have lost everything they had already accumulated. And so when he watched her doing this, meticulously going here to there to salvage everything she could salvage, they again understood her value, that she had this ability and that she would do what was necessary to keep the expedition going. And really from that 1 month into her joining the party to the end of it, there's a continuous kind of growth in their writings of her value. We get to the point by the time that they meet the Shoshone, where they start referencing her as the pilot of this expedition, that they see, like I said, they listen to her, they value her. And it started out early on where she's, trying not to drown herself. It was rough waters and she salvages early on this mission. And then when they get to the end of the waterway part, they have to take these pirogues and they have to hide them, hopefully, to find them again. We know this is effective here, especially in Florida, because more than any other state, we found dugout canoes. Dugout canoes have been used all over the state of Florida, and we found more here than any other state because all the waterways we have, all the indigenous that use them, you would definitely store them away for the next year. And if you didn't get back there the next year, then 1,000 years later, we dig them up. They just did one in North Carolina. North Carolina, they just found a 930-year-old dugout canoe. So they're still laying around. Maybe that can be one of our expeditions. So when they get off their pirogue, they hide it, and it does make it all the way back to their final leg of their journey, and he keeps hauling their goods for them. And as they're crossing, they really start to get nervous around August, because August in the north, it might still be warm in summer, but you recognize as anyone walking that winter's going to set in soon. And especially when you're in that northern place, you don't know if it's going to be September or October, but you recognize very soon that winter is a possibility. And Sacagawea said, no, it's this waterway or the next one where my people live. She started recognizing her homeland. She started recognizing where she grew up. And the next riverway, 60 Shoshone ride up. And that once again had to be something, because you're a group of 35 people or 45 people in the core discovery, and 60 Shoshone ride up on horseback. You know, ask, first of all, what you're doing in their territory. Then you get to explain to them how it's your territory. That had to be fun. And then Sacagawea gets to interpret that for you. What a job. And as they meet the Shoshone, they sit down to talk because Lewis and Clark recognized that they couldn't continue the journey overland without horses. You're not going to make it across the Rockies. What are we going to do? Are we going to camp on this side, add another year to the expedition? If we don't have horses, you could see the snow-capped Rockies in the distance. No one had seen anything of this vastness other than Sacagawea and potentially Toussaint Charbonneau, because there were just these huge mountains and with snow, recognizing it's August and you needed assistance. So they sat down with Shoshone to barter for horses. And pretty much really soon after starting to talk, Sacagawea ran over and hugged the chief because it was her brother. Her brother had become the chief of the Shoshone when her mother and father had died. And with that death and her hugging him and, you know, crying because she hadn't seen her family and she'd just seen her homelands in 4 years. You know, she has a husband and a baby and all these white guys with her. I'm sure they had an exciting conversation about how she got to that place. So they talked, and because of that, he agreed to barter, sell, or give whatever they needed for the expedition. And this is the part where it's unknown if they would have succeeded without her. Because if no tribe would have helped them, then that would have been the end of their journey. The Rocky Mountains would have just geographically been an impossibility. They might have tried to continue on, probably with the loss of life, because even with her help and with the animals, they almost starved to death. So that kind of just happenstance that she came upon her own people. They were able to get a couple horses, a mule. Her husband bought her a horse, and she was able to guide them. And her Shoshone brother guided her through the Rockies to the other side. And even when they got to the other side, they were starving because, as I mentioned, that all meat diet, they were really getting lethargic. They were really in need of something else. And so she found these camas roots. And if you get the wrong ones, they're poisonous. So these camas roots are these like little tubers, kind of soft potato that you cook up or you make into flour when you're on the go. You cook them up, eat them. You're not making flour and bread. And she found these to help continue to sustain as they got up along the other side of the Rockies. One of the places they could have easily lost the entire expedition because of everything I've already mentioned so far: weather, starvation, not coming around the right people. So once they get past there, they have to still continue on all the way from Idaho to the coast. And as they meet the Nez Perce in Idaho and then continue on and meet the Klatstop and the Calumet and the Salish and Washington and Oregon, they get all the way to the West Coast and they have to set up another winter camp. First of all, they were just grateful to have made it to the coast, but they were hungry because supplies were low. Fortunately, a lot of times when you live along a coast or a waterway or an ocean, there are things to eat in that ocean. And if you're lucky enough, you can trade with the locals. And they traded with the locals, not only for meals, but once again, the young men traded for other things. That was a commonality of the trek from St. Louis to the Pacific, was the men were often engaged in extracurriculars with the indigenous women for a lot of reasons. One, what else do you have to do? Two, indigenous women didn't have any kind of like a Christian problem with having sex with strangers. It was seen as kind of, first of all, there could be gift giving. It was seen as a good thing for your tribe. But that also means the spread of venereal disease, which went back and forth across the Lewis and Clark expedition, one of the lesser known things exchanged between us. It was purported that we gave you guys syphilis. So there's that. Not the highlight of the trip. So on the trek, they got to the West Coast. And this is where we know for sure, because of the Lewis and Clark expedition, where they voted as a group on where they're going to set up winter camp. And York got a vote, the slave, and Sacagawea got a vote, the woman. And that was all recorded as part of where they're going to set up winter camp. And I mention it once again because it's going to be part of her legacy as a woman who got to vote with the U.S. Army as having value. Her opinion and voice by this point had proven over and over and over again to have value. And then in November, the expedition went to see the Pacific Ocean, and they did not invite Sacagawea. You're going to stay here at the camp. We're going to go look at the ocean. We'll be back. And she was presumably pretty upset about this, as one would be. And so setting up camp in November and building Fort Clatsop in December, one of the other things they had to contend with was boredom. Because as we know from COVID, when you sit inside for 5 months and it's raining outside and miserable and you're just trying to survive, is if you don't have a lot to do, you'll find things to do. And they heard about a beach whale. A beach whale was laying down there and she said, okay, I've come this far. I'm going to go walk down and see this monstrous fish. And they relented. In January, she got to go see the Pacific Ocean. But that to me is nearly heartbreaking to think you'd walk 8,000 miles and not get to see like the ocean. That had to, just as much as the Rocky Mountains in a maze, had to be amazing for somebody that had never seen an ocean, that had lived from Idaho to North Dakota. So while the men had seen the Atlantic Ocean, she had never seen something that was comparable. So she walked over, saw the monstrous fish. But this whole winter was tough. And in terms of Oregon, Washington weather, it wasn't. It was actually a pretty mild winter. It was rainy, it was icy, it was cold, but it wasn't terrible. That still didn't mean they weren't starving and bored. And a problem a lot with the cold and the warm of rain and snow is they'd hunt, but then their elk would spoil. Because unless you're in frozen territory, as it warms up again, then your meat spoils continuously. You have to continue to hunt on indigenous land that's not your land. And actually, this wasn't even their land because the whole Washington, Oregon territory continued to be disputed for the next 50 years. This wasn't part of the Louisiana Purchase. This was outside of the bounds of what they had purchased. So they traded with the indigenous for sturgeon, for these little smelt, for the Wapato tubers, things to continue to eat. But really, they were very much in despair, to the point that Clark recorded when Sacagawea handed him a piece of bread that she had saved for her baby that she just had been kind of feeding him, and she gave it to Clark, and he recorded how grateful he was for one slice of bread. So continuing on with her value and how she's balancing taking care of her child with taking care of this expedition, and proving over and over a giving nature, which I'm not sure I have. Then also Pomp. I haven't mentioned Pomp a lot. Her child, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, the nickname was Pomp, which some reports say was given by Clark. But it's reported that the Shoshone used that nickname for firstborn in their tribe. So it's much more likely she gave him the nickname Pomp, and they just played off it with other things like Pompey and Little Pomp. And they were bored, and he loved this kid. Clark grew to just really adore this child as he, the foursome of Charbonneau, Sacagawea, Pomp, and Clark were always together through this expedition. They weren't without each other through this expedition. And that's going to prove important because in those later years, he's going to take care of that child. So after the wet, cold months, They're on their return journey, which very quickly they wanted and needed to get once again back across the Rockies. They wanted to do it as quickly as possible. As I mentioned before, they had some kind of daydream that a ship would come save them, but there was no ship that was coming to save them. For the most part, most of America thought that Lewis and Clark died on this expedition. They were gone 2.5 years. You don't presume that they were going to make it through all this enemy territory, but they're still making it back. On their way back, continuing to do their job of mapping the land and the flora and the fauna. They continue to separate in July. Lewis goes one way, Clark goes the other, with Charbonneau and Sacagawea. And as they continue along, he writes about the Indian woman who has been of great service to me as a pilot. Through this country, recommend a gap in the mountain more south, which I shall cross. So she knew about the Bozeman Pass. She knew about this pass, and she related to him, hey, instead of going this way, let's go this way. Once again, after this kind of time, he listened to her. And when you're overland walking, I imagine that has to just be salvation to find this like one little pass through the mountains that you can continue to get through. They follow the path. They then were going to stumble upon Pompey's Tower in Montana. It's this landmark, which eventually becomes a national monument called Pompey's Pillar. And it had a bunch of Native American petroglyphs on it. And then William and Clark's going to do his part and sign it, put his graffiti on there. And I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. And as the members would reunite in August, down from the Yellowstone, within days, they would drop the Charbonneau couple off at their village and continue their last leg back to St. Louis. So this is going to be the tower that they come upon. And there's some quotes up there for you about arriving at this tower. It being this just wild outcropping in the middle of nothing you could stand upon and gaze upon all the directions. Ancient petroglyphs up there. Clark's name still exists to this day. Changing the name from the tower to Pompey's Pillar and it becoming a national monument, 2001. We can still go visit that today. And that goes back to being a parent. I have no doubt that Sacagawea had some pride in her child being part of this expedition and being endeared to William Clark and him naming place names after him. And maybe not being able to look back on this, but having some recognition that, hey, myself and my kid made this journey and we get to be recognized for it. So part of the return trip, when they arrived back, there was just all kinds of pomp and circumstance because they thought they were dead. Of course, there's pomp and circumstance. And when they came back, they were given, double what they were promised in terms of land. So the captains each got 1,600 acres. Everyone in the Corps of Discovery got 320 acres, plus $500, which in $800 is a nice sum. And York and Sacagawea got none of that because they returned to the land where their value wasn't as valuable. York was still a slave, and as an enslaved man to Clark, when he told Clark he wanted to go back to his wife who lived in Louisville, so this is where we go back to they always had unmarried men on the expedition. Clark didn't even know his slave was married and had a family. And when he wanted to go back to Louisville, he sold him in New Orleans instead and said he was lazy and had no value. So York had to work the rest of his way back to get to his wife and family. Sacagawea as well, married to Toussaint Charbonneau. He got the land, he got the money. They moved back to the Mandan village for a number of years until Clark convinced him, because he's going to become the superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1822, but he's going to move up as a general. He's going to be governor of Missouri Territory. He's going to convince Charbonneau and Sacagawea and presumably Otter Woman, since she's still around, to get some land down in Missouri and come become farmers and live by him. Because he wanted Jean-Baptiste, he wanted Pomp to get a Western education. He wanted that child to have a different future. And there's a variety of reasons we could say that. He was endeared to that child. Potentially, he really enjoyed, Sacagawea. It was a way of paying her off because he told Toussaint Charbonneau she deserved more. He told him that after the payout happened and she got nothing, that as part of this, she deserved more. So potentially this is a way of giving more. And Lewis himself is going to commit suicide or be killed in a gun battle early on after the years. Clark's going to live up to a long age. And part of his life is going to be the adoption of her children. Sacagawea, when they return and they moved to Missouri, Charbonneau was not an effective farmer. They had to go back out and start fur trading. And she's also going to give birth to another child, Lizette, a little girl. And Clark is going to adopt her children. And this is where things get murky. This is where academia and oral history overlap. So we do know, though, that Jean-Baptiste went to school. He was adopted by Clark. He then becomes a celebrity because of who he was, went on the expedition. German royalty has him come stay for 6 years. He has a baby over there with some German heiress. Baby dies, he moves back, lives in California, finds his fortune, lives until his 60s. But for Sacagawea, she gave birth in 1812. And in 1813, the children were adopted by Clark. Now, in Missouri, children weren't supposed to be able to be adopted unless both the parents were dead. We know Charbonneau wasn't dead. He's going to live until about 1843. And this is where a clerk at the fort where they were living, Fort Lisa, reported that Charbonneau's wife, about 25, died of fever, and that she had left a fine infant girl, which Sacagawea just had an infant girl, Lizette. But Otter woman was the same age. And we have no record of her other than the one mention of her one time. So Clark, though, when he was recording the last of his expedition notes, wrote down that she was dead, that Sacagawea was dead. But a woman lived out her years. She had lived with a Comanche, married into the Comanche, and when she died in 1884, the lore was that she was Sacagawea. Her name with the Comanche was Porovo. She was chief woman of the Comanche. She had told an oral history about helping white men get to the Pacific. She had one of those Jefferson Peace Medals. There were 89 in existence in the West. She had a son named Baptiste, a new son named Baptiste. This goes back to maybe she read the book on the celebrity of her and pretended to be her. Maybe she really was her. What we know is Dr. Charles Eastman, Sioux physician, first doctor who was indigenous to get a degree in Western medicine, first doctor for the indigenous, did an investigation and he said, no, that's her. Enough evidence shows that that is her. A university professor wrote a book, but it was in this era when she wrote the book, so it was all kind of flowery about her being an Indian princess and not heavy on the facts, really heavy on the emotion. So this goes to her not being her. And so whether she died in Fort Lisa or whether she died as an older woman, the story of her is still extraordinary in what she did on this expedition. And so her legacy. Out of the nearly 5,000 statues, and that's not including monuments or parks or anything else, just statues to people, only 8% are women. And there are 16 of her, which is, we know, the most of any American woman. And so her contributions, the US Navy named 3 ships after her. The stamp was introduced in '94, gold dollar, 2002 to 2008. She was only at the time the second indigenous. We now have a Hawaiian woman and Wilma Mankiller on a couple of pieces of money. But she's memorialized for everything she did, including especially with the suffragettes. The suffragettes really recall she was the first woman to vote, that the records show she voted, and that her ability to have this equality meant we should all have this equality. And so her legacy goes through them to us. So there is your story about the lady adventurer forced upon a long march and finding massive success because you're smart and capable and get things done. All right, questions, or I've gone the whole hour, or thank you. Any questions? Had quite enough.
What are your thoughts about her ending? Which story do you believe?
So I like to believe that she lived on, just because it makes me happy. As an academic, this is where I said the lines between being an academic and a historian. I'm told to believe both of them, because here's the records, but it's very possible in Fort Records they wouldn't know Otter Woman from Sacagawea. They called her Charbonnet's wife. There were two of them. There was another option. And then I like to romanticize her and Clark. You know, maybe he wrote that she was dead so she could go live off the rest of her great life without this guy that tried to rape a woman early. I mean, I can't imagine he was a fur trader, hardcore frontiersman, 20 years older than her. I can't imagine that was a match made in heaven. So that's, and then we're taught now more so than ever to believe oral history. The thing that gets me is the peace medal. How did you stumble upon a peace medal that you had in your possession? She was with the Comanche, her husband died, so she moved back with the Shoshone. And, you know, telling this lore, naming one of her kids Baptiste. I mean, I'm not sure that's the most common of Western tribal names. So I like to believe that one.
Thank you for a great presentation. I was wondering if you could recommend one or two books to read on the expedition itself that you would suggest as a good read.
I actually can't. I've read so many of them, and I have this problem as an academic. I can't remember authors and publishers and titles unless I really think about it. But I will send Debbie 2 or 3 recommendations after this when I go look at my bookshelf. So apologies.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. Being raised in the West Coast and being very familiar with the area, I just found it fascinating, but you brought to life the story of the expedition. My question is, do you know what's happened to all the peace medals?
Some of them, I believe 1 or 2 are in the Smithsonian. I think some have been salvaged. I think most were lost to history, the vast majority. Like I said, I think 1 or 2 are still in the possession of either a tribe or the Smithsonian, but it's very, very few. That being said, others were struck, like James Madison struck his own peace medals. So it wasn't just Jefferson, there were multiple sets of them that are going to continue on with other presidents. We had a question over here. You can just ask it.
I've always wondered why they drifted so far north instead of saying on a more southerly route, where the weather would have been better.
Yeah, I presume Spanish-Mexican border would be more hostile, especially anywhere near the Comanche or the Apache were known militaristic tribes. So the waterway of the Missouri proved to be kind of more, you want to take as much water as you could. You want to go along waterways. So the Missouri kind of forced that geographically. Because otherwise you would have had to just go straight overland the whole entire journey, which is just, 10 times harder than going by waterway. So it was the geography plus the tribes of the South were known to be much more militaristic, kill without being concerned about what women or babies in the group.
Well, thank you so much again for a great presentation, bringing Sacagawea to life. Thank you.